Pastor Troy.
Hey, Pastor Luke.
Here we are, moving along through our Old Testament survey with our confirmation videos. And today we are looking at the book of Judges. And so Judges follows the book of Joshua. And so if we remember from our last lesson, Joshua led the people of Israel into the promised land, into Canaan, and they conquered and they took the land and they divided up among the 12 tribes of Israel. And the book ended with God giving the people rest, but also Joshua, when he's an old man, he charges the leaders and all the Israelites, hey, make a choice. Either follow God or follow the pagan idols. And if you follow God, things will go well with you.
You'll get to live.
You will get to live. If not, bad things are going to happen.
You're going to die.
And in the book of Judges, we're going to see what choices the Israelites make following the generation of Joshua. And so we'll just tell you up front, it does not go well for the people of Israel. They continually rebel against God. They continue to forget Yahweh, forget all the things that God had done for them, that He brought them out of slavery, that He gave them the land of Canaan, this land for them to live in, to make their own homes. They continually forget that. They worship other gods, and they are oppressed, they're conquered, they become very violent, and just one bad thing after another in the book of Judges.
It goes from, well, it's not really bad. I mean, it's good they get to go into the promised land. They're doing pretty well, and it just gets progressively worse. Their memories get shorter and shorter. Well, okay, Pastor Luke, though. So this is the book of Judges, around 12 different judges-ish. We're going to talk about just one, but I got to ask you, what is a judge?
So a judge, we think of somebody like in a courtroom with a gavel. That's not what a judge is.
Court is in session.
Yeah, this is not what a judge is here. A judge, the judges that we're going to be talking about, they're more like rulers or governors, that kind of thing, or even military leaders.
Deliverers.
Deliverers, yeah. So God raises up these judges to deliver the people of Israel from their enemies.
So kind of, I mean, like Moses and Joshua weren't necessarily called judges, but they served that function. They were leaders in a time, well, people always need leaders, but they were leaders, and especially in military conquests. They weren't really kings per se. That's what a judge is?
Yeah, so this is the time, because following this is when God will give Israel kings. And so they don't have kings yet, but God has raised up these special men and women called judges to deliver and to lead and to rule the people of Israel.
And we're talking about, so like the book of Numbers was around 40-year period, right? Or Joshua, Numbers, the book of Judges covers like 300 years.
Yeah. All right, so as we get started, a helpful framework for understanding the book of Judges is there's a continual pattern throughout the book, a cycle, if you will. And the cycle is the people of Israel, they sin. They
go away from God.
They commit idolatry. They worship false gods. So that's the first point. Next, they are punished, and so they are oppressed by their enemies.
Bad things happen.
Like the Philistines or the Midianites, they come and conquer the people of Israel. Then, bad things are happening, so what do? They repent.
They think now's probably a good time, maybe we ought to remember God.
Yeah, so they return to Yahweh, they pray to God, God, help us, we're sorry, we messed up.
Yeah.
And then God raises a judge to deliver them, so they are rescued, and so they're delivered, and they have a period of peace. But then they forget God again, and they stumble back into sin and idolatry, and the cycle continues. And the thing with the cycle, it repeats, but each time it just keeps getting worse. It's like a downward spiral. They just the situation just keeps getting worse. And the judges, they keep getting worse. Even though God raises up these judges, a lot of them, most of them, they're not that great people either. Samson, Gideon, they're kind of goofballs too. They sin. They don't always follow God in the best of ways either. So we'll see that just this downward spiral of just one catastrophe after another.
Yeah, and the judges come out of different tribes. There's not one particular tribe that has judges kind of spread across the tribes.
Yeah. So let's take a look at chapter 1 of Judges and verses 27 through 36. And so just very briefly looking at these verses, this is just an example of, one of the problems very early on is, so Joshua led the people of Israel, they conquered Canaan, and one of their commands that God gave them was to drive out all of the Canaanites, all the people that lived in Canaan, to get rid of all of them, drive them all out.
To purify the land of impure things and people.
Because these people, they worship false gods.
Right.
And it's not that they just worshiped the false god. It's some of the practices they did with these false gods were terrible things, like
nasty
sexual immorality, child sacrifice, all these. And God, just straight up evil. And God, He does not want His people participating.
He doesn't say you can't have any of it. He doesn't say, oh, but keep a little.
No.
You're supposed to have none of it.
None of it. And so one of the problems, and we see this in chapter 1, is they did not drive out all the Canaanites.
They didn't do what God said.
Yeah, they let some of them stay. Some of them continue to live in the land of Canaan. And as sinful people, I mean, the Israelites, they're sinful people. As sinful people, we are easily drawn to other sin. We are easily swayed by sin. And the Israelites will see this. They are drawn to those Canaanites. They start, hey, you got a pretty cool God. We'll start worshiping your God Baal or whoever it is. And they forget God. And so right away, the problem that starts off is they didn't get rid of all the Canaanites.
And then they get corrupted by corrupt people.
Yes.
Rather than the way that it's supposed to work is that God makes them holy or priests to other people so they can bring God's reign, but when they forget about God, they just get corrupted and messed up by the people around them.
Yeah. So if we jump to verse 10 of chapter 2, this follows the death of Joshua and his generation, which his generation by and large was pretty faithful to God. They messed up here and there, but they were pretty faithful. But that generation dies off, and so verse 10. And all that generation also were gathered to the fathers, that is, they died. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that He had done for Israel.
They forgot.
And so right away, in the next verse, in verse 11, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. The Baals are false gods. And so they don't know God, they forget God, and right away they're worshiping false gods because those Canaanites around them are influencing them.
Kind of like, in some sense, like when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and Aaron lets the people make a golden calf. Same sort of thing.
Yeah. So quickly forget God and all that He has done for them.
And it says in verse 12 of chapter 2, they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Joshua. They abandoned and they went after other gods.
Yeah. So they are just flat out rejecting God and chasing after, their own sinful desires.
Well, it says they bowed down to these, and then it says, and they provoked the Lord to anger.
Yeah. Because what is the first commandment, Pastor Troy?
You shall have no other gods.
God does not want to share our worship with any other god.
Not because it makes Him more God, it's just better for us.
Yeah, it's because we'll see when we worship false gods, it's not good. It's not good for us. It's not good for those around us, and it breaks God's heart when His people stumble into idolatry and wreck their lives.
Because He wants us to actually live
lives
that are great rather than just to kind of exist and shrivel up.
So if we jump to verse 16 then of chapter 2, so the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. So again, the cycle, they stumble into idolatry and sin. God sends their enemies to oppress them and to conquer them, and then they repent, and God raises up judges for them to save them. So jumping then to chapter 3, verse 7, we're going to take a look at the first judge. His name is Othniel.
Okay.
And so we'll just go ahead and read that as kind of an example of what the judges were like. So picking up in verse 7. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot their Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, false gods. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and He sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hands. And his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. We see here the cycle of forgetting God, idolatry, punishment, repentance, judge, deliverance, peace. But then we'll see right again, they stumble into sin again. So Othniel is the first judge, and he's a pretty good judge. There's nothing, the Bible doesn't tell us that he made any mistakes or did anything wrong here. But we'll see as the judges move along, their character gets more and more flawed, more sketchy as the judges move along.
Well, things went well, it says, then for 40 years. And then he dies.
They forget.
And they forget,
Yeah.
and they get a message.
Yeah. So we're just going to mention several of the other judges. So that, as you said earlier, there are 12 judges in the book of Judges. There's 6 major ones and 6 minor ones.
Okay.
So some of the major ones include my favorite, a left-handed guy named Ehud. So all you left-handed are friends. You got a guy here.
And he carries in his left hand a special dagger.
Yeah. Because he hides his dagger on his right side.
So chapter 3, verses 12 to 20. So you're going through these in chronological order?
Yeah.
Okay.
Next we have a woman judge, Deborah.
Yes.
God raises Deborah up. Then we have one of the more famous ones, Gideon, with the fleece and all that. Gideon, he's got the small army of 300, all of that. So again, we're flying through these things, but we recommend that you check these out. There's some pretty cool stories here, so go ahead and check that out. Then we have a guy named Jephthah. He's kind of a thug, not a really good guy.
Yeah.
And then we have, who's probably the most famous of the judges, Samson. Big, strong guy, also a Nazirite, so he had some special vows.
Couldn't cut his hair.
Strong, powerful. He kills lots of Philistines, wins lots of battles. But he may be a physically strong guy, but he's kind of a morally weak guy.
Sounds like he's got an ego.
Yeah.
That goes with that.
Yeah. He does a lot of not good things.
Yeah.
And but ultimately, God still works through him as well. And then we have 6 minor judges. We don't need to go through them. Just 6 other guys that are mentioned just by name, do a couple things.
Yeah.
So we're going to jump now toward the end of the book. So let's jump to chapter 17. So again, this is about a 300-year period, and things just keep getting worse.
Right.
The judges are worse. The people of Israel are worse. In chapter 17, verse 6, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Do we have a problem here, Pastor Troy?
Yeah, and it doesn't sound a whole lot different from today. That, I don't need a king. I don't need anybody to be in charge. I'll just be in charge. Everyone can be in charge of themselves, which ends up in a mess.
I don't need God. I don't need God to tell me what to do. I want to do what I want to do.
Hey, you do you, I'll do me.
Yeah.
The problem is when I do me, which means I'm just going to kill you, or you kill me, or whatever, it's a problem.
Yeah, and so this verse here is actually, it's pretty bad because it really highlights how bad things are really going to get in the next 4 chapters or so in the book of Judges, because things get real bad, real dark. There's rape and sexual abuse, there's murder, and then the people of Israel, because of these things, they fall into a civil war. So God's people are killing each other. The tribes are fighting against each other.
They're all doing what's right in their own eyes.
Yeah, and it's a disaster.
Yeah.
There's a lot of corruption and violence, and it's awful. This is not what God wanted for his people at all.
Well, the people need a leader, and not only that, and they need a good leader, and a good leader is a leader after God's own heart.
Yeah. That
reminds them who God is and who they are in him.
Yeah. So as it said in verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel. That is repeated a couple times. In 18 verse 1, in those days there was no king in Israel. Verse 1 of chapter 19, in those days when there was no king in Israel. So God is leading the people of Israel up to something here.
Yeah.
But finally, let's take a look at the final verse of the book, chapter 21, verse 25. Which just repeats what we heard in chapter 17.
Yeah.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So this is actually an awful way to end this book.
Yes.
That there's no king, so there's no godly leader for the people of Israel. Everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes, and what's right in the eyes of sinful people is wrong in the eyes of God.
Yes.
So the book actually ends in a very terrible place.
Good thing it's not the end of the whole story.
Yes, because as we've been talking this year, God has made promises to his people, and he is faithful to those promises, even when we have a book like the book of Judges where the people of Israel go nuts and completely forget Yahweh. God is still faithful. And what the clue is with the king, God is going to give the people of Israel a king. Now, they're going to get some pretty terrible kings as well,
right,
but they are going to get some decent kings. David, who he makes a lot of mistakes too, but King David, Josiah, Hezekiah, a handful of other good kings. But ultimately,
there are less good kings than bad kings.
Yes. But ultimately, the kings will all be pointing to the King
of
Jesus,
kings,
Jesus, who is a son of David.
Yeah.
And so God is not forgetting his people. He's not going to abandon them. He's going to be faithful with them, even in the mess of all their sin. Even when they are doing what's right in their own eyes, God is going to continue to love them, care for them. He's going to chastise them. He does that a lot. He does punish them, but it's because he loves them and cares for them.
Yes.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and wrap up there, and we'll see you next time.
All right. See ya.